Welcome to a podcast for radicals. In this series, we explore how history, radical thought, and collective action intersect to shape movements for liberation and justice. Today, we're tackling a critical question. How have authoritarian leaders throughout history systematically targeted dissent from leftists, anti-fascists, and radicals? And why do these tactics still matter for those of us working toward a freer, more equitable world? This episode examines how leaders like Mussolini and Hitler used tactics designed to eliminate their opposition, especially the organized left. We'll explore how these same authoritarian strategies echo in modern times, particularly in the US, and consider how these tactics impact radical movements today. History is not a series of isolated events. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Actions taken by those in power create ripples that influence and inspire others over time. Just as the U.S. policies toward Native communities, forced relocation, ethnic cleansing, and land seizure influenced Hitler's approach to racial and territorial control, authoritarian leaders worldwide have drawn from each other's methods, refining and adapting techniques to consolidate power and suppress opposition. By highlighting these recurring strategies, we can better understand how authoritarian tactics persist and evolve, so that those of us committed to justice can recognize these patterns, prepare, and resist effectively. We're not here to fixate on specific labels. Instead, we'll focus on identifiable patterns and strategies that authoritarian regimes use to suppress opposition. Along the way, we'll draw on historical insights, and we'll turn to a radical guide to anti-fascist organizing to ground our understanding in the long-standing tradition of anti-fascist resistance. Before we dive into the details, let's clarify a few key terms that will guide our conversation. Throughout this episode, you'll hear us use terms like authoritarianism, fascism, and anti-fascism. Each of these has specific meanings, and while scholars continue to debate their precise boundaries, understanding their widely recognized distinctions will help explain why we're choosing certain language over others. Let's start with authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is a system of governance where power is centralized in the hands of a single leader or small elite group, often with limited checks or accountability. In authoritarian systems, dissent is stifled, freedoms are restricted, and the ruling group or individual exercises control over many aspects of public and private life. Think of it as a top-down structure that seeks obedience and punishes resistance, with leaders making broad claims of keeping order or protecting stability. Now, fascism takes this authoritarianism a step further. Fascism is a specific type of authoritarianism, one that is extreme, ultranationalist, and highly exclusionary. Fascist movements seek to purify the nation according to a rigid, often racial or ethnic ideal, and they usually target marginalized communities and dissenters as scapegoats. Fascism is also hyper-militaristic, aiming to create a society that's disciplined, unified, and unquestioning, often with the state's violent power on full display. In short, all fascist regimes are authoritarian, but not all authoritarian regimes are fascist. While both suppress dissent and centralize power, fascism has a distinct nationalist and exclusionary focus. Understanding this difference helps us analyze the tactics we'll discuss, especially when we examine modern examples that may have fascist tendencies without fully aligning with the fascist model of the past. Finally, anti-fascism, or Antifa, is a broad, decentralized form of resistance. It's an inclusive global movement that stands against fascist, authoritarian, and oppressive power structures. Anti-fascists recognize that threats to liberty, equality, and community self-determination can emerge from state and non-state actors alike. They respond with a range of tactics, organizing communities, engaging in direct action, and defending marginalized groups from targeted violence. Throughout the episode, we'll refer back to these definitions to explain why certain tactics are considered authoritarian or fascist, and how anti-fascism continues to respond in creative, community-oriented ways. Our goal is to show how certain authoritarian tactics have persisted across eras, evolving to suit different contexts, but always aimed at silencing dissent. Whether in 1930s Europe or present-day America, these tactics target anyone who resists centralized oppressive power. As radicals, understanding these tactics isn't just an academic exercise. It's essential for building strategies that protect our movements and amplify our impact. By identifying these patterns, we can prepare to resist them. So let's look at the roots of fascism and the threat posed by the left in post World War I Europe. As we begin exploring authoritarian tactics to silence dissent, let's start by going back to Europe after World War I, a period marked by deep economic and social upheaval. The war left much of Europe devastated. Entire cities were in ruin, economies struggled to recover, and the inflation rate in countries like Germany skyrocketed. By 1923, Germany's hyperinflation reached an unimaginable level, with the cost of everyday goods doubling in a matter of days. In Italy, unemployment surged dramatically. By 1921, around 2 million Italians, nearly 25% of the industrial workforce, were out of work. These conditions created a climate ripe for social movements. For many working class people, the left, socialists, communists, and anarchists represented hope for a fairer society. Radical groups organized workers, called for unionization, and demanded systemic change that would empower ordinary people rather than the elites who had thrived before the war. Leftist organizers promoted economic justice, challenged capitalist exploitation, and envisioned a society rooted in collective decision making. It's worth noting that the post war experience varied across Europe. While Germany's economic collapse and Italy's high unemployment were especially severe, other countries faced different challenges. Despite these differences, there was a shared sense of crisis, and in many places, radical leftist movements stepped forward to respond to people's needs and demands. But these radical movements didn't go unchallenged. In Italy, fascist leader Benito Mussolini saw the left as a direct threat to his vision of a centralized hierarchical state. In 1922, he threatened to seize control, saying, "Either we are allowed to govern or we will march on Rome." This wasn't just rhetoric. He soon organized the March on Rome, a calculated show of force that resulted in Mussolini being appointed prime minister. Mussolini's supporters, known as the Black Shirts, used violence to disrupt leftist meetings, intimidate socialists, and silence critics. In response, anti fascist movements began to organize. One of the early examples is the Arditi del Popolo in Italy, a grassroots anti fascist militia formed in 1921. This group, which included anarchists, socialists, and communists, directly opposed Mussolini's black shirts by protecting communities from fascist violence. They organized to guard rallies, protect union gatherings, and defend neighborhoods from fascist intimidation. Although the Arditi del Popolo had some success in resisting fascist attacks in local areas, they were ultimately outnumbered and outmatched by Mussolini's rapidly growing forces, highlighting both the potential and limitations of grassroots resistance. Meanwhile, in Germany, the fascist threat emerged somewhat later. Hitler's National Socialist Party began gaining traction in the late 1920s, and by 1933, he had risen to power, quickly establishing himself as Germany's authoritarian leader. German leftist groups, having observed Mussolini's tactics, began organizing to counter the Nazis. One example was the Roter Front Kämpferbund, or Red Front Fighters League, a German communist paramilitary organization. Formed in 1924, it aimed to counter Nazi intimidation, protect leftist gatherings, and defend workers' rights. The group famously declared, "We will stand against any force that seeks to subjugate the working class," embodying the spirit of early anti-fascist resistance in Germany. However, like the Arditi del Popolo, they faced violent crackdowns as Hitler consolidated power. These early anti-fascist actions, organized by groups determined to defend their communities, set the stage for later strategies in anti-fascist organizing, where local action, community defense, and direct confrontation became core tactics. While not always successful, these early efforts established a framework for collective resistance that continues to inform anti-fascist movements today. This brings us to a central theme of our discussion. Fascist and authoritarian regimes, then and now, see leftist movements as dangerous because they challenge the concentration of power and represent organized, collective resistance. The threat wasn't just that the left opposed them politically, it was that these movements were capable of mobilizing people, inspiring them to envision a society that wasn't rooted in domination. By grounding ourselves in this historical context, we can see why authoritarian leaders feel the need to suppress, discredit, and even violently target the left. As we move through the episode, we'll explore these suppression tactics in detail and examine how these early dynamics continue to influence authoritarian responses to radical movements today. To understand how authoritarian leaders secure and maintain power, it's essential to look at how they create enemies within their own societies. Both Mussolini and Hitler saw organized leftists as existential threats, not just to their political dominance, but to their vision of a unified, hierarchical society. For them, eliminating leftist influence was a way to create a pure and orderly state with no room for the egalitarian values that leftist movements represented. Mussolini and Hitler used a powerful tool to justify targeting leftists: propaganda. They branded socialists, communists, and anarchists as dangerous, unpatriotic, and even subversive. Mussolini's newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, often published inflammatory articles about the so-called Bolshevik menace, framing socialism as a threat to Italian unity. In a 1921 speech to the Italian parliament, Mussolini denounced socialism as a luxury that a nation of defeated people cannot afford. He positioned his fascist movement as the solution to this internal danger, rallying public fear against leftists who were portrayed as enemies of the state. In Germany, the Nazis took a similar approach. Official Nazi publications like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Stürmer frequently published articles depicting communists as traitors to the German people. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, often referred to communists as the state's primary internal enemies, warning that they sought to contaminate and weaken German society from within. This relentless campaign of fear-mongering created a hostile environment that justified Nazi crackdowns on the left. This kind of messaging created a shared sense of fear and urgency. By casting leftist dissent as a threat to public safety and national unity, these leaders could justify violent repression under the guise of restoring order. And this wasn't just about rhetoric. It translated into real, violent actions against leftists. What's striking is how this tactic hasn't gone away. Modern authoritarian figures still frame leftist groups as internal threats to justify repression. In recent years, we've seen leaders across the world, including here in the US, invoke similar rhetoric. President Trump, for instance, repeatedly described left-wing protesters and activists as domestic terrorists during his time in office. Just this past October, he stated, "I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within, not even the people that have come in and are destroying our country, radical left lunatics." Trump's language plays on the same fears that Mussolini and Hitler stoked, a fear of internal chaos caused by those who challenge the status quo. By labeling dissenters as radical left lunatics or domestic terrorists, leaders can easily justify repressive measures. This rhetoric shapes public opinion, leading many people to see the left not as legitimate opposition, but as a dangerous force that must be subdued. These fear-based tactics also sow division among the public, making it easier for authoritarian leaders to consolidate power. The success of this strategy lies largely in propaganda, turning the internal enemy into a common adversary that society can rally against. In the 1930s, state media and official publications were essential to spreading these narratives, reinforcing the idea that leftists were a danger to national stability. Today, however, the dissemination of this rhetoric happens even faster and more broadly, thanks to digital platforms where misinformation can spread widely and rapidly. Modern authoritarian figures and their supporters leverage social media's reach to amplify fear-based narratives, targeting activists, protesters, and left-leaning groups as existential threats. Specific tactics include the use of bots to flood social media with coordinated messages, creating an illusion of widespread support for these views. There's also the practice of dog whistling, where leaders use coded language that rallies their supporters while maintaining plausible deniability. This kind of online strategy intensifies the divide, setting up leftists as an ever-present, untrustworthy other within the country. The impact of these narratives was profound. In Italy, Mussolini's black shirts, armed with public support for their mission, openly attacked leftist groups under the justification that they were protecting Italy from chaos. In Germany, the Gestapo quickly gained public approval for their violent repression of leftists, thanks to the widespread belief that communists were planning to undermine Germany from within. In both cases, these narratives not only justified violent repression, but also enabled large scale purges, imprisonments, and even murders of those deemed enemies of the state. It was this very propaganda that empowered groups like Mussolini's black shirts and Hitler's brown shirts to operate with impunity. Once the public had accepted the left as a dangerous internal enemy, these paramilitary groups could act as violent enforcers of authoritarian control, facing little to no consequences. Now, let's explore the role of these parastate actors, examining how they became essential tools for enforcing fascist rule and how similar groups today continue to serve authoritarian interests. As we've seen, authoritarian leaders like Mussolini and Hitler worked hard to paint leftists as internal enemies, creating a hostile public perception that allowed them to justify brutal repression. But they didn't rely solely on official state forces to carry out their agenda. Instead, they empowered paramilitary groups, unofficial actors who operated outside the normal rules, using intimidation and violence to enforce authoritarian rule. In Italy, Mussolini relied on the black shirts, or squadristi. Formed in 1919, initially as small fascist squads, the black shirts quickly grew into a powerful force. By October 1922, when Mussolini orchestrated the March on Rome, October 27, 29, leading to his appointment as prime minister by King Victor Emmanuel III, the black shirts numbered around 200,000. These men, often veterans of World War I, were loyal to Mussolini and embraced his vision of a fascist Italy. Wearing black uniforms to signal their allegiance, they used violence to intimidate socialists, communists, and other leftists. They disrupted rallies, attacked union gatherings, and were notorious for forcing socialist organizers to drink castor oil, a tactic intended to humiliate and physically weaken their opponents publicly. After taking power, Mussolini further legitimized the black shirts by transforming them into an official state militia in 1923, known as the MVSN, Militia Volontaria per la Sicurezza Nazionale, which took oaths of loyalty to both Mussolini and the king. After becoming an official state militia, the MVSN expanded its reach throughout Italian society. Its members maintained their black uniforms and fascist symbols while acting as both an internal security force and a parallel police force. By 1927, they had about 132,000 active members, with units established throughout Italian institutions, including schools through the Opera Nazionale Balilla youth program, universities, and workplaces. This institutionalization of fascist violence meant that leftist opposition now faced not just street thugs, but an official arm of the state with legal authority to suppress dissent. In Germany, Hitler had his own version of the black shirts, the brown shirts, or Sturmabteilung, SA, also known as the Stormtroopers. The brown shirts began forming in 1920, initially as a gymnastic and sports division of the Nazi Party, before officially becoming the SA in 1921. The organization was formally recognized by the Nazi Party in November 1921, when Hitler took full control of the party, transforming it from a sports division into a paramilitary force. By January 30th, 1933, when Hitler was appointed chancellor by President Hindenburg, the brown shirts had swelled to over 2 million members. Like the black shirts, the brown shirts enforced Nazi ideology through violence and fear, disrupting communist and socialist meetings, attacking leftist organizers, and patrolling the streets to ensure Nazi dominance. However, the SA's power wouldn't last. After Hitler consolidated his control, he saw the SA's massive size and independent ambitions as a threat. In what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, June 30th, July 2nd, 1934, Hitler ordered a purge of SA leadership, including its chief Ernst Röhm. While the organization survived, it was significantly weakened and subordinated to the SS, with its role reduced to training and political indoctrination. This brutal suppression showed how even parastate actors could be discarded once they'd served their purpose in eliminating opposition. These historical examples have striking parallels today. Over recent years, we've seen the rise of right-wing paramilitary groups in the US, such as the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters. While the government doesn't officially sanction them, their actions are often aligned with the goals of certain political figures. During the first 2020 presidential debate on September 29th, moderated by Chris Wallace, Trump was asked directly to condemn white supremacist and militia groups. Instead, he addressed the Proud Boys, saying, Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what, somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left. Members of the Proud Boys widely interpreted this phrase as tacit approval, and it quickly became a rallying cry within the group. The impact was immediate. On Parler, Proud Boys chairman Enrique Tarrio posted, "Standing by, sir," and the group began selling merchandise with the phrase. While Trump attempted to distance himself the next day, saying, "I don't know who the Proud Boys are," the moment had already galvanized the group's supporters. The phrase would later be cited in House January 6th committee hearings as evidence of how this rhetoric mobilized far-right groups. The Proud Boys have since become known for their violent confrontations with leftist protesters and anti-fascists. Like the black shirts and brown shirts, they position themselves as defenders of order, claiming that they're protecting the country from leftist chaos. These groups use social media for recruitment, spreading messages that echo far-right and nationalist ideologies, much like early fascist groups use propaganda to recruit loyalists and enforce their influence. However, it's important to note some structural and legal differences. Unlike the black shirts and brown shirts, today's groups are not formal extensions of a political party, nor does the state openly sanction them. Instead, they operate within a gray area of legality, claiming to be independent, often under the guise of patriotism or community defense. This legal ambiguity allows them to act with a certain level of freedom while distancing themselves from official accountability, enabling their leaders to sidestep direct responsibility for their actions. For example, after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville on August 11th, 2017, where various far-right militia groups and white nationalists engaged in violent clashes with counter-protesters, several group leaders claimed they were merely exercising their right to assemble. Groups like the Oath Keepers and other militia organizations that were present framed their actions as security and self-defense. By avoiding formal political affiliations and presenting themselves as independent actors exercising constitutional rights, these groups maintained plausible deniability, even as their activities clearly advanced broader political goals associated with the far right. This legal ambiguity gives them leeway to mobilize without facing the same level of scrutiny that official state forces might encounter. Unlike the black shirts or brown shirts, today's groups have a powerful organizing tool: digital media. These groups can recruit, plan, and amplify their actions through social media and encrypted messaging platforms. Private communication channels allow them to coordinate events, while public social media platforms help them spread fear-based narratives and attract new members. In this sense, they function as a digital militia, adapting traditional paramilitary tactics to the modern era. Research has shown that, in many cases, these groups use misinformation campaigns to divide communities further, casting leftist groups as the root of social instability. They portray themselves as heroes defending traditional values, often using a similar justification to what Mussolini and Hitler used to empower their paramilitary enforcers. This digital amplification allows them to operate far beyond their physical presence, shaping public perception and normalizing violence against their perceived enemies. The impact of these parastate actors in Italy and Germany was catastrophic. With tacit or direct support from their leaders, the black shirts and brown shirts terrorized leftist groups into submission, often with little to no intervention from official law enforcement. This approach allowed fascist leaders to maintain plausible deniability, claiming they weren't directly responsible for the violence while benefiting from it. In both Italy and Germany, these paramilitary groups were essential in silencing opposition, clearing the path for authoritarian control. The role of these paramilitary groups in enforcing authoritarian power is crucial to understanding how authoritarian systems thrive. By empowering loyal, violent actors outside the official state, authoritarian leaders can enforce their rule without direct government accountability. As we continue, we'll look more closely at how this tactic of suppressing dissent through unofficial enforcers has influenced modern authoritarian leaders and how resistance movements have adapted their strategies in response. Let's examine how authoritarian leaders went beyond these unofficial forces, turning to legal systems and surveillance to repress dissent. By legitimizing their crackdowns as necessary security measures, they expanded their control and made it even harder for leftists and radicals to resist. As authoritarian regimes consolidate power, they often move from targeting opposition groups in the public sphere to more direct repression, internment, and imprisonment. This tactic of containing and isolating dissent is one that fascist regimes in both Italy and Germany adopted early on. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, as Mussolini and Hitler gained more control over their respective governments, both regimes established forms of internment to isolate and neutralize political opponents. In Mussolini's Italy, the regime established a formal system of political exile known as confino through a law passed in November 1926. Italian anti fascists, socialists, and other dissidents were sent to remote locations across the Italian peninsula and to a network of prison islands, including Lipari, Ponza, Ventotene, Tremiti, and Ustica. These exiled individuals, known as confinati, were stripped of their political influence by being isolated from their communities. Exile was a way to break the will of activists, disrupting their lives, separating them from support networks, and cutting off their ability to organize. By 1927, around 2,500 people had been sent into confino, including prominent intellectuals, political leaders, and Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci. This number would grow dramatically over the years, with estimates suggesting that between 12,000 and 15,000 people had been subjected to confino by 1939. While not concentration camps in the way we often think of them, these isolated areas functioned as containment zones meant to weaken Italy's leftist opposition and silence its leaders. In Germany, Hitler adopted even more severe methods, leading to the establishment of what would become one of the most infamous systems of repression in modern history. On March 22, 1933, less than 2 months after Hitler became chancellor, Heinrich Himmler ordered the establishment of Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp. Under the euphemistic term protective custody, Schutzhaft, the camp was initially intended for communists, socialists, trade unionists, and other political opponents. By the end of 1933, approximately 150,000 people had been imprisoned in various early camps across Germany. These camps operated as centers of torture, forced labor, and psychological intimidation aimed at dismantling leftist organizations and instilling fear in potential resistors. Unlike Mussolini's approach of isolating dissenters, Hitler's regime created a mechanism of outright terror, setting a standard for state-led violence against political enemies. Today, in many democratic countries, the suppression of dissent often manifests through extensive surveillance rather than outright internment. However, democratic nations like the United States have a history of using internment camps, and recent rhetoric from the recently elected president includes threats of similar tactics against leftist and migrant communities. This blending of surveillance with the specter of internment underscores how democratic systems can adopt authoritarian practices, especially under leaders seeking to silence opposition. One of the most infamous historical surveillance programs was COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program, conducted by the FBI from 1956 to 1971. Under COINTELPRO, the FBI targeted civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, Black liberation organizations, and other leftist groups through surveillance, infiltration, and psychological warfare. Through tactics like wiretapping, spreading misinformation, and encouraging violence between rival factions, COINTELPRO aimed to neutralize these movements. The program ultimately contributed to the disruption and suppression of multiple activist groups, including the Black Panther Party and the anti-Vietnam War movement. Following COINTELPRO, the post 9/11 era brought a new wave of surveillance measures in the name of national security. The USA Patriot Act, short for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism, was passed in 2001 and expanded government authority to surveil individuals within the U.S. It allowed the FBI and other agencies to conduct electronic surveillance, monitor internet activity, and access financial and communication records without a warrant under certain conditions. While the act was initially framed as a counterterrorism measure, its broad language allowed for the surveillance of protest groups and individuals with no links to terrorism, raising serious concerns about civil liberties. Court decisions, such as Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project 2010, have further upheld surveillance measures by criminalizing certain forms of association with groups labeled as terrorist organizations, even if the association involves nonviolent legal activities. These legal precedents have contributed to a surveillance state in which activists, particularly those associated with anti fascist or leftist movements, may be targeted and monitored under the guise of preventing domestic extremism. One of the critical lessons from a radical guide strategies on anti fascist organizing is the need for enhanced security and digital safety. Activists today must remain vigilant about safeguarding their communications, using encrypted messaging, and minimizing digital traces. Understanding how modern surveillance operates allows today's anti fascist and radical movements to adapt, taking measures to protect organizers' safety and privacy in ways that earlier movements may not have been able to. The move from political suppression in the streets to physical internment represents a severe escalation in authoritarian regimes. This pattern is evident across Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, and in the tools used by modern states to restrict the influence of radical movements. As we've seen, once an authoritarian regime consolidates power, its tactics tend to evolve from intimidation to physical containment, with the goal of eliminating opposition entirely. Understanding these historical precedents, activists today can better recognize warning signs and prepare to protect themselves and their movements from targeted repression. As we examine the tactics employed by Mussolini, Hitler, and other authoritarian figures, we see that certain strategies recur. Today, in the US, these authoritarian tendencies may not fit perfectly into the historical mold of fascism, but the patterns of targeting dissent, promoting extreme nationalism, and using paramilitary or parastate actors are unmistakable. We'll take a closer look at some of these modern day echoes, particularly within the political climate of the last decade. In recent years, we've seen clear parallels in the tactics used by authoritarian leaning leaders to target dissent and consolidate power. For instance, President Trump frequently labels leftist activists, protesters, and movements as threats to the nation. By using terms like domestic terrorists to describe protesters and left wing movements, Trump echoed the kind of rhetoric used by authoritarian leaders of the past to delegitimize dissent and justify state action against it. This broad brush approach not only casts leftists and activists as enemies of the state, but also set the stage for increased scrutiny and police presence at protests. Furthermore, during his first time in office, Trump deployed federal law enforcement to suppress protests, most notably in Portland during July 2020. Under Operation Diligent Valor, agents from the Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Marshals Service were sent to Portland, where protesters were met with tear gas, impact munitions, and arrests by officers in unmarked vehicles. This month-long federal intervention, characterized by aggressive tactics and a lack of agency identification on uniforms, reflected an authoritarian approach to handling civil unrest that prioritized force over democratic engagement. As we saw with Trump's rhetoric toward paramilitary groups, leaders can embolden militant organizations without direct control. In the first 2020 presidential debate, Trump was asked to condemn white supremacist groups. Instead, he told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. This phrase was widely interpreted by the group as tacit approval, leading to an immediate reaction. Proud Boys chairman Enrique Tarrio posted, "Standing by, sir," and the phrase quickly became a slogan and rallying cry. The aftermath of this endorsement was visible in the actions taken by groups like the Proud Boys on January 6, 2021. According to findings from the House January 6 committee, this rhetoric played a role in mobilizing the group, as members saw themselves as protectors of a political agenda. The committee documented how far-right groups, already active in planning and coordinating the attack, cited Trump's words as a form of encouragement. This emboldening of private militias to engage in political violence without official accountability recalls how historical authoritarian regimes use paramilitary groups to enforce control while maintaining plausible deniability. Another key authoritarian tactic we see mirrored today is the attack on independent media, though in a distinctly different form from historical precedents. Following the press control measures we discussed earlier in fascist Italy, modern authoritarian leaders have developed different approaches. Rather than directly controlling media through registration and censorship, we see attempts to delegitimize independent journalism. In modern US politics, we see a tactic of delegitimizing independent media rather than directly controlling it. Trump first used the phrase enemy of the people on February 17, 2017, tweeting, "The fake news media, failing at New York Times, at NBC News, at ABC, at CBS, at CNN, is not my enemy. It is the enemy of the American people. This marked the beginning of a repeated attack on the press, with Trump frequently labeling unfavorable coverage as fake news and calling journalists the enemy of the people. While not implementing direct control over the media, this language eroded public trust in independent journalism and created space for alternative narratives favorable to his administration, echoing the discrediting tactics seen in authoritarian regimes. A significant part of modern authoritarian rhetoric involves stoking fear and division. Trump's presidency provided numerous examples, from his June 2020 declaration of Antifa as a terrorist organization to his repeated characterization of protesters as radical leftists threatening American values. By framing political opposition as a dangerous internal threat, leaders can justify extreme measures and rally supporters to support these measures as essential for protection or security. This divisive language, positioning certain groups as existential threats, echoes Mussolini's and Hitler's strategy of scapegoating leftists as enemies of the nation. In examining these parallels, it becomes clear that authoritarian tactics do not require a fully fascist regime to manifest. Authoritarian leaning leaders can use the encouragement of extra-legal actors, demonization of dissent, attacks on the media, and divisive language to consolidate power without dismantling democratic structures outright. For modern anti-fascists and activists, recognizing these patterns is essential for understanding how authoritarian power grows and how these tactics can create an environment hostile to democracy and social movements alike. Now let's look at the consequences of criminalizing dissent and the strategies anti-fascists have developed to resist this repression. The goal is to identify ways to counter these authoritarian tactics and ensure that the space for democratic protest and radical organizing remains open and protected. We've seen how authoritarian leaders historically targeted dissenters with both propaganda and physical violence. But another critical tactic is using the law itself as a weapon, criminalizing dissent to consolidate power, eliminate opposition, and intimidate activists. In this final segment, we'll explore the legal and political consequences of criminalizing dissent, both historically and in our current political landscape. We'll also highlight some strategies anti-fascists and activists use to counter these authoritarian tactics. In fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, laws were systematically weaponized to eliminate opposition. In Mussolini's Italy, political repression was codified through the public security laws, Testo Unico delle Leggi di Pubblica Sicurezza, enacted on November 6, 1926. These laws banned opposition parties, created the Special Tribunal for State Defense, and enabled authorities to detain political dissidents indefinitely without trial. Similarly, in Germany, the Reichstag Fire Decree, Reichstagsbrandverordnung, enacted on February 28, 1933, following a fire at the German Parliament building, suspended civil liberties guaranteed by the German Constitution. Officially titled the Decree of the Reich President for the Protection of People and State, it allowed police to detain people indefinitely without charges and was immediately used to arrest Communist Party leaders, effectively criminalizing political dissent as a threat to national security. Both of these measures illustrate how legal systems can be manipulated to serve authoritarian goals, creating a pretext for criminalizing entire political movements. By casting political opposition as subversive or dangerous, these leaders effectively shut down any organized resistance, leveraging the law to create an environment of fear and repression. While the U.S. has not seen the extreme legal measures of 1930s Europe, we do see elements of criminalizing dissent through selective use of laws and policing. Following the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, several states enacted legislation aimed at restricting protest activities. Florida's HB 1 and Oklahoma's HB 1674, both passed in 2021, included provisions shielding drivers from civil liability if they claim self-defense when hitting protesters blocking roads. Iowa's SF 342 increased penalties for protest-related activities. These laws effectively criminalize forms of civil disobedience that have long been staples of American protest movements. Federal agencies have also played a role. On May 31, 2020, then President Trump tweeted that The United States of America will be designating Antifa as a terrorist organization. While there is no formal federal process for designating domestic groups as terrorist organizations, the statement contributed to heightened surveillance and police action against left wing activists and organizers. The use of terms like domestic terrorism to describe protest movements not only stigmatizes dissent, but also expands the scope of surveillance and policing, making it easier to target activists under broad national security claims. Organizations such as the National Lawyers Guild, founded in 1937, provide crucial support by offering legal observers at protests and legal defense for activists facing state repression. Similarly, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, established in 1990, provides guidance on digital privacy and cybersecurity, helping activists mitigate the risks associated with organizing online. These resources allow activists to protect their communications and maintain safe organizing spaces despite increased state surveillance and repression, echoing historical anti fascist tactics used to operate safely under threat. The criminalization of dissent has a profound impact on democratic societies. When protesting, organizing, or even speaking out becomes risky, fewer people engage in public life. This erosion of civic engagement weakens democracy, as the voices that challenge or critique power are often silenced first. Historical examples from Italy and Germany show how these measures, when unchecked, can lead to one party rule and the elimination of democratic spaces entirely. In the US, the consequences may not reach the scale of historical fascist regimes, but they still create a chilling effect. Protesters facing charges, heightened surveillance, or police intimidation are less likely to continue their activism. Over time, this can lead to reduced participation in social movements, diminished community organizing, and fewer avenues for meaningful change. Protecting the right to dissent is essential for maintaining a democratic society, especially as global political tensions rise. Throughout history, anti fascists have developed strategies to resist state repression and counter the criminalization of dissent. Direct action, mutual aid networks, alliance building, and public education are all key components of contemporary anti fascist organizing. Mutual aid, in particular, has gained traction as activists work to provide essential resources like food, shelter, and medical assistance within their communities, reducing reliance on state support and reinforcing solidarity. Another essential strategy is counterpropaganda, where activists work to challenge the narratives presented by authoritarian leaning leaders and state controlled media. By creating alternative platforms, sharing firsthand accounts of events, and using social media to spread awareness, anti fascists aim to undermine disinformation and present their perspective to a wider audience. As we've explored in this episode, the tactics used by authoritarian leaders to criminalize dissent and repress political opposition have deep historical roots. Today, these tactics may take different forms, but their purpose remains the same: to limit the power of the people to question and challenge those in authority. For modern activists, understanding these patterns is essential. Recognizing and resisting the criminalization of dissent not only protects social movements, but also strengthens democracy itself. In the face of rising authoritarian tendencies worldwide, the role of anti fascist and radical organizing is more vital than ever. By staying informed, building resilient networks, and employing strategies of mutual support, activists continue the fight for a world where dissent is not only tolerated but celebrated as a fundamental democratic right. As we wrap up this episode, we've explored how authoritarian leaders past and present have targeted dissent and opposition. From Mussolini's propaganda campaigns to the federal response to protests we discussed, authoritarian tactics share common themes. They aim to delegitimize, intimidate, and ultimately suppress those who question or resist centralized power. This isn't just a historical pattern, it's a warning. Recognizing these tactics when they appear, whether in overt or subtle forms, helps us understand how movements for justice are often met with resistance, not only from visible opposition, but from systemic repression. History shows us that the forces working to silence dissent evolve with time, but so do the strategies of those who resist them. For those engaged in the work of organizing and resistance, this history is a guide. Knowing these patterns allows movements to adapt and to build support networks that go beyond reacting to repression and instead work proactively to maintain spaces for dissent, and democratic engagement. As we've discussed throughout this series, understanding authoritarian tactics is essential for anyone committed to building a just and free society. The right to dissent, to organize, and to hold power accountable is central to that vision. By studying the past and recognizing these recurring strategies, we equip ourselves and our communities to defend these rights and to continue working toward liberation, even when faced with opposition. This episode is part of a guide for radicals, a comprehensive resource on radicalism, history, and collective action for dismantling oppressive systems. Your support makes our work possible. If you appreciate our content, please consider making a tax-deductible donation. Every contribution directly sustains our mission to bring you in-depth analysis on the ideas that drive radical change. Visit radicalguide.com to support. Thank you for listening to a podcast for radicals, and remember, follow ideas, not people.